free trade agreements. Certainly topical right now is how will we feature deforestation and forest degradation in the implementation of the Mercosur agreement. And I think that's certainly something where there might be questions and comments about, and I will be happy to respond. Now, in the finance and investment, on the one hand, we have the issue of our partnership activities with DEFCO in the lead, where we want to support producing country to mobilize public and private financing for that purpose, but also with the Sustainable Finance Action Plan and the work on taxonomy, we're trying to make sure that also for the investment and finance sector, it's being very clear on what is that actually, and with its impact on deforestation and forest degradation. And we are currently working on a delegated act that should clarify that and make it sure for the investment sector, what is a good investment and what is a bad investment. Finally, there is a wealth of information out there on deforestation, forest degradation, changes in land use and the world's forest cover. But there is nothing that allows policymakers, decision makers, public and private, to access the necessary information in an easy, digestible way. We are working currently with the Joint Research Center of the European Commission on establishing an EU Forest Observatory, which actually will have the function to providing a one-stop shop for people who want to take decision with regard to investments, with regard to purchases, with regard to value chain, to see what are the hotspots, what are problematic areas. And we hope that we will be coming live with the first intermediate products in the first half of 2021, and that it will be fully operational by the second half of 2022. And that's something that will be a huge emphasis on our work. Now, Jonathan, if I still have a little bit of time, I could go back to the timeline for the work on the legislative proposal that the Commission has promised for the second quarter of 2021 and describe a little bit of the process. Or if you prefer, I stop here and come back to that later in the discussion if there are questions about that.
Hey, Hugo, why don't you take 2 minutes and lay out the timeline? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can, and I will do that. Thank you very much. So after the communication, the European Green Deal, the Biodiversity Strategy, and the Farm to Fork Strategy all sharpened and clarified the commitment of the Commission by saying that the Commission commits to put forward a proposal legislative proposal in 2021. At the same time, the Parliament started to work on a legislative recommendation according to Article 225. And we have started to undertake the impact assessment coupled with the fitness check on EUTR and FLEGT, which will have started with we contracting a major study to support our work on that. We opened a public consultation on both the fitness check and the legislative proposal in September that will run into December. So I hope a lot of people will participate in that with their own thoughts and their own contributions. We hope that by the end of the first quarter, we will have an impact assessment and a proposal ready. We will, of course, pay close attention to what the Parliament is proposing, as President von der Leyen has promised. And I think we're looking at the full range of options with regard to possible instruments, such as instruments based on due diligence, maybe coupled with, complemented by, or replaced by a model such as the EU regulation on illegal, unreported, and unauthorized fishing. We'll also look at the role that certification schemes could play in the implementation of any mandatory system. We'll also see whether mandatory labeling is something that can play its role or whether that is not sufficient. And of course, we'll also have to look at whether more stringent measures are possible in that regard. I think that the Parliament's report has provided us with a wealth of good ideas. Some of it, I think, we will have to check against the principles of proportionality and effectiveness. I think that our impact assessment will go a little bit deeper into that and supplement what the Parliament has already done. So we're looking forward to an interesting year 2021, and of course further up in proposing, and not to close without saying we are of course closely working together with other colleagues in the Commission that work on, for instance, the initiative on corporate social governance from DG Just, and of course our colleagues in DG DEFCO that are busy setting up considerable support portfolios for work with third countries. I stop here and I thank you for your attention.
Thanks very much, Hugo. That's you've given us an excellent overview of everything that is happening, and I mean, what I take to be a kind of key message is that there's a lot that remains to be determined through impact assessments, fitness checks, consultations, and so on about where the Commission is going to try to lead the EU. Next, I want to give the floor to Duncan Brack, who I think will also provide some more content about what are the specific options that are really open to the EU. What should the EU decide as a result of all of these consultations and reviews? So over to you, Duncan.
Thanks very much indeed, Jonathan, and thank you for inviting me. Good morning from rainy London. I'm going to share my screen as well, if I can find the right window. There we go. So I hope you can all see that. All right. Right, so this presentation follows quite nicely on from Hugo's, in that I've been involved in a number of studies that have tried to put forward proposals for what the European Commission ought to come up with as a result of the consultation and impact assessment process that Hugo described. And I mean, Hugo's absolutely right, 2021 will be a really exciting year and really that offers lots of opportunities for moving forward in EU external action against deforestation. So the what I'm going to say is explained in a bit more detail in 3 different studies that I helped to work on. And the first one was a piece of work for the Tropical Forest Alliance, which is a public-private partnership involving quite a lot of major companies who are active in this area, in the agricultural sector, and also NGOs and governments. And you can find the summary of a series of roundtable discussions that we held over the first 4 months of this year. It was published in July. You can find it on the Tropical Forest Alliance website. And that argued the case for a smart mix of measures. And Hugo's really touched on this. You can't address through any single policy instrument all the different environmental, human rights and governance impacts of the production of agricultural commodities, the things that Hugo was talking about. But there are many instruments that can contribute. And therefore, we argued that regulation needs to provide a framework for all stakeholders to play a role. Action by producer country governments, the countries of origin of the products we're talking about, is necessary to improve standards of governance and law enforcement, and to put in place many of the enabling conditions necessary to achieve sustainable production of agricultural commodities, such as basic services, infrastructure, support for farmers. Companies based or operating in the EU, because the EU provides a major demand for many of these commodities that are produced with negative impacts like deforestation or child labour. So companies that are trading in these products need to be required to source agricultural commodities to high standards of sustainability, minimising negative impacts. And then the EU and its member states need to put in place a framework of market regulation to promote the sale of sustainably produced commodities and to limit or eliminate the sale of commodities produced to lower standards. So that's the kind of outline of the Tropical Forest Alliance findings, the series of roundtable discussions that we had. And actually that same group of companies and others are now going into this in more detail, and we hope to be able to feed into the European Commission's process. I was asked also to contribute to a study for the German government, BMZ, the Development Ministry, that looked into some of these proposals in more detail. And we looked at 3 particular areas: bilateral agreements with producer countries, so meeting the first objective I set out, action on the ground in producer countries; due diligence legislation, putting in place a framework of legislation affecting the behaviour of companies based in the EU, and then public procurement policy, offering a promotion, helping to promote the sale of sustainable commodities in the European market, though there may be other options there. And all this together helps to build sustainable supply chains. So these are kind of key elements of the smart mix of measures. The study's not been published yet, though I think it's out quite soon. They haven't given me a final date, but it ought to be published quite soon. And so it goes into these in some more detail. And I'll just run quickly through those three main elements. So bilateral agreements with producer countries. I won't go into this in much detail because I believe Saskia is going to talk about it in a bit more. But it's clear that many factors that affect agricultural production and the negative impacts associated with it can only be tackled on the ground in producer countries. You can't expect companies based in the EU to affect everything. And in particular, and we see this in particular in the timber sector, but also in other areas like cocoa, weaknesses in governance and law enforcement in producer countries underline many of the problems of the sector. So what is needed is, and what the EU has the capability of doing, is to negotiate a series of bilateral agreements with producer countries, putting in place a framework of actions to improve governance and law enforcement. And we have seen this, how this might work in the timber sector with the voluntary partnership agreements that have been negotiated between the EU and timber exporting countries as a result of the FLEGT initiative. In principle, we argue in the BMZ study and also in the TFA study, Tropical Forest Alliance study, that the model is in principle a good one, though that's focused just on eliminating illegal logging. And for agricultural commodities, we need to look at sustainability, not illegality. It's a good model, partly because it puts in place a national deliberative process in the producer countries, not just a consultation process, but actually a deliberative process involving lots of different stakeholders, government, companies, forest communities, NGOs, to debate and determine the standards for sustainable production and to agree on a program of reforms of policies, laws and institutions. And that all goes into the agreement that the producer country reaches with the EU. Now, the EU needs to provide a trade incentive, which we argue along the same model as the VPA model. It requires the establishment of a national traceability scheme and a due diligence requirement for commodities placed on the EU market. So you ensure that only commodities produced to the sustainability standard can be exported from the country of origin to the EU. And you need, of course, capacity building assistance from the EU to put in place this improved framework of governance and law enforcement. If full agreement is not possible, and I mean, there's a lot of discussion of this in the BMZ study when you come against it, we think it would work well for cocoa in West Africa, less well probably in practical terms for other commodities in other countries. The EU could nevertheless support elements of this framework, a national deliberative process, a stakeholder process bringing together all the stakeholders in the supply chain, national traceability schemes. That could still be useful, even though the full agreement is not possible. But I hope Saskia will go into this in more detail. So let me come on to the second element here, due diligence legislation. And the idea here is, you'll probably be familiar with this, the obligation of due diligence on companies requires them to scrutinize their supply chains and reduce the risk of exposure to defined harms. Now, Hugo mentioned the DG Justice proposal, which is to bring in a broad due diligence obligation for companies. We don't know the size of the companies, probably just the larger companies, for human rights and environmental harm. So they will be put under an obligation to scrutinize their operations and supply chains for the presence of human rights abuses and environmental harm and do their best to eliminate it. That's welcome, but we think it's probably not specific enough. And certainly, I think all of the companies involved in the Tropical Forest Alliance process were clear that we needed to be very much more specific about what the exact criteria they are that you're asking companies to exercise due diligence for agricultural supply chains. So we argue that this needs to be accompanied by specific legally binding guidance for particular commodities. And that might be a separate legal instrument. And this might come out from the DG Environment consultation process at the moment. The main commodities we're talking about here, I think, are the main forest risk commodities: cocoa, palm oil, soy, beef and leather, have had quite a lot of scrutiny. Coffee and rubber, I think, are important and have by and large tended to be less well studied. So I kind of put them in brackets there because I'm less familiar with the conditions of the supply chain, but these are the ones that should be considered for the exercise of due diligence legislation. Now, I talked about the criteria, and I think there's an urgent need now for a discussion on what criteria we're talking about. What do we want companies to exercise due diligence for? But we are talking in the BMZ paper about criteria such as respect for the laws of the producer country, respect for internationally recognized human rights, land rights, particularly critical for the production of many of these commodities, environmental standards going beyond national legality standards, such as deforestation, protection of high conservation value or high carbon stock forests, and so on and so on. And indeed, we're not starting from scratch in many of these cases. There are lots of existing standards around. There's OECD guidelines, there's the Accountability Framework Initiative, there are certification scheme standards. So it's not like we have to start from scratch and invent all these. Now, I just want to look a little briefly at the practicalities of enforcing this due diligence legislation. And here this draws on the study that I wrote together with Saskia, which was just published, I think, last week, called Enforcing Due Diligence Legislation Plus. And it's published by Fern. You can find it on the Fern website. And we looked at the practicalities of how you might enforce this these due diligence criteria, looking particularly at experience from the EU timber regulation and also other legislation as well. And we reached the conclusion that enforcement needs to be by a government agency with adequate resources and powers. You can't just leave it up to individual cases taken through the courts. The due diligence criteria, I mean, there's obviously going to be a tendency or an incentive to put in as many criteria as you can think of, but that would be a mistake. Criteria should be simple and clear as possible to make it possible for companies to implement them and for government agencies to enforce them. And we've seen, even with the timber regulation, which has quite a limited range of criteria, it has proved quite difficult for enforcement agencies to enforce some of the criteria there. And ideally, they should be subject to means of verification which are not completely dependent on evidence from the producer country. And again, experience from the timber regulation shows that it is quite difficult to obtain hard evidence of breaches of law from the producer country. Cooperation with producer country enforcement agencies often doesn't exist and is not very good. So if you can use, for example, satellite data on the extent of deforestation over a defined period, so it's independent verification, or DNA or isotopic testing to scrutinize what products the company is putting on the market, that is a good outcome. The obligations should include a requirement to publish a report on the company's due diligence system. This improves transparency of the system and its activities in implementing it. The quality of the due diligence system itself should be held to particular standards and could be audited. These are all ways of making the whole system better. We believe, and both the Tropical Forest Alliance and the BMZ reports say this, the due diligence obligation should extend throughout the supply chain with no threshold by company size. The Dutch child labour due diligence law requires companies either to exercise due diligence for the presence of child labour in their operations and supply chains, or to obtain a certificate from the company they're sourcing from that company has itself exercised due diligence. And that seemed to us quite a good system in principle to avoid placing heavy burdens on small companies a long way away from the countries of origin. But there should be some obligation on every company throughout the supply chain. And indeed, of course, the legislation must require complaints and remediation systems, a way to flag up problems and to get them tackled with. Now, the main risk of due diligence, we recognize this, is that companies might simply abandon high-risk areas or suppliers in pursuit of implementing the legislation. And that needs to be thought about. And there may be a case for a transitional period during which the companies have the chance to work with the suppliers and producer countries to try and sort out the problems and resolve them, rather than simply abandon them completely and move to lower risk areas. So I'm probably going over time, so just briefly, my last slide is looking at the other element that we looked at in the BMZ study, the German study on public procurement. In addition to these two elements, I think there is also a need to see producers of sustainable commodities enjoy higher rewards for the products they're meeting. They're probably going to incur higher costs, at least in the short term, so they need to have higher rewards in the market. And that's quite an important area. And I think one thing the FLEGT initiative hasn't really tackled, but one way of addressing it is to use public procurement policies, specifying the products that government agencies in the EU and other consumer countries buy. And they can use their public procurement policy to create protected markets where only products meeting specified standards can be bought. And generally speaking, we have a positive experience with many timber procurement policies. Almost every EU member state and many other countries have them now for specifying sustainable and legal timber. So we argued in the BMZ study that member states should be encouraged to introduce a comprehensive public procurement policy for agricultural commodities. And indeed, some of them already have these in place, specifying things like organic or fair trade products. And a few of them have deforestation related criteria as well. The range of products you can talk about are could be subject to argument. Those are the commodities that I think the European Commission study back in 2013 identified as having the main impact on forests. Forests, of course, is not just the only environmental negative impact. You could look at water consumption. You have different commodities there. Certification systems are important because they're an easy way, a relatively easy way for government buyers to identify the products they want to buy. And so you want to look at the penetration of certification schemes, and that's quite high in those commodities, less high in others. The EU procurement rules require provision for products meeting equivalent criteria to those in certification schemes. So you can't just say we will buy certified products. So you need to give suppliers of the products some chance of demonstrating that they're meeting the same criteria to certification scheme standards, and governments would have to appoint an agency to determine this. Central government is often not a big purchaser of food products. Often regional and local governments for schools and hospitals and care homes and so on are bigger purchasers, so similar approaches should be adopted there. And there is a EU-wide voluntary process to try and raise criteria and adopt common criteria for procurement policy, and we should aim for greater ambition in the next version of the criteria for food and catering. So Jonathan, I'm afraid I've probably gone over time, but that's a really rapid run through of those 3 studies that I talked about.
Yeah, thanks very much, Duncan. I think it's really crucial that we also have the substance of the different proposals on the table for discussion. And let me, we're starting to get questions coming through in the Q&A. And so let me just remind participants that you're free to submit your questions now. You don't have to wait till the Q&A period. So our next speaker will be Saskia Ozenkhan. I think she's going to go more into depth on the question of partnership agreements with producer countries. Saskia.
Thank you, Jonathan. Yes, like Duncan said, I want to go a little bit deeper into the partnership agreements. Firm just published a paper actually today, and you can see the link down there on the slide about why partnership agreements should be at the heart of EU efforts to end deforestation. And next slide, please. And before I go into these partnerships agreements, I would like to talk a little bit about going back to the 1980s. In the 1980s, I was a campaigner at Friends of the Earth Netherlands, and we were told by anthropologists working in Sarawak in Malaysia that deforestation was a big problem there, and that indigenous people were blockading logging roads to stop that timber being exported to Europe. So we thought we had to do something about it, and together with colleagues in Belgium, in the UK, and in Germany, we campaigned to stop the imports from Sarawak coming into the EU. And we were quite successful in the sense that at least imports from Malaysia dropped by about 30%, in some cases 40% even. However, deforestation in Malaysia continued unabatedly. So that made me realize that actually demand side measures, well intended in this side of the world, doesn't always have the impact that we want to have on the other side of the world. Next slide, please. And the reason for that is that deforestation is a wicked problem. I mean, environmental NGOs never like it when I say that, because they say, you know, what does wicked mean? And of course, it doesn't mean musical. But still, I think it's important to really put out very clearly that the deforestation is a very complicated issue. It's not a linear cause effect thing that can be resolved by sort of simple actions like banning imports from Malaysia or by the Amsterdam Declaration group saying that they're not going to only buy sustainable palm oil, or by companies making that sort of commitments. All of that is very welcome and it's important, but it's clearly not enough, because it's a problem that involves unpredictably, and also it involves conflicts of values among different shareholders. So to really, really tackle what deforestation is, you have to have this, what Duncan says, this smart mix of measures, but you also need to go deep and you need to get broad, you need to get to really systemic change. So it's a very, very complicated issue. Next slide, please. So because of all that, we think, and like Duncan also said, the real change has to happen in the producer countries. So a partnership approach between the EU and these producer countries, how to tackle these forest-based commodities, is clearly the most effective way forward. And in the paper we published today, we looked at 8 partnerships. They're listed on the right there. I mean, some of you might not be very familiar with them, but they include the Cocoa and Forest Initiative. They include the African Palm Oil Initiative, and an initiative which is actually funded by the EU, but which many may not have heard of. It's called Tefertzaya. Anyway, looking at those 8 initiatives, we sort of realized that the ones who are most effective in the sense that they have a real impact on the ground in producer countries are the ones that don't only spell out what needs to change, but they also need to spell out how that change should be happening. Many of those initiatives don't do that. Another reason why they would be effective is that they have very clear incentive for all actors to do the right kind of thing. And the third important and also often not implemented element is that these partnership agreements need to have effective monitoring and enforcement tools, because without that, they just stop halfway through or they run into the sand, they're not moving forward. The people need to be held accountable for the actions that they do. And last but not least, and I think this is very widely accepted now, is that these partners need to be really truly multi-stakeholder processes, including not just big companies, but also small and medium enterprises, and also local community and indigenous people's representatives, which are often very marginalized and very difficult to get to the table without capacity building efforts. Next slide, please. So what should be in that partnership agreement is, of course, to be decided by the partners of the agreement. We can't say that from the beginning, whether it should be zero deforestation, whether it should be no illegal deforestation, whether it should be not deforestation, but ecosystems degenerated across the board. Whatever it may be, it's very clear that the definitions are being thought through very clearly. We see with the soya moratorium that although it was very effective of tackling deforestation in the Amazon, it actually possibly led to deforestation in the Cerrado and possibly also in neighboring countries. So the definitions you choose, what you include and what you exclude, has clearly repercussions for other areas. So that's important to think through. Then there's the issue of customary rights. There's a lot of lip service placed these days to customary rights, but I think the essence of the importance of it is still not really well understood. There was a study done by the Mundum Project a few years ago, where they looked at 73,000 concessions in 8 different countries, and they figured out that in 93% of the cases, those concessions were actually planted on land that was being owned by customary people, by customary communities in a customary way. But because the government doesn't recognize that, they give these concessions out, and of course that leads to conflicts. So addressing the whole issue of customary rights up front in any partnership agreement, we think is absolutely critical, as is of course the issue of smallholders, because it's easy to sort of get regulation in place, which makes companies then sort of kick smallholders out of the supply chain because they're less controllable and there's less transparency there. So that's another important content issue that needs to be discussed in any partnership agreement. Then there is the process. Duncan mentioned a little bit about it already. He said it has to be not a consultative process, but a deliberative process. I think it's important to understand that, of course, you need to have all the right people around the table. Everybody will understand that. People don't always understand that that means that it takes a lot of time to get the right people around the table and a lot of capacity building to get the right people around the table as well. And similarly with the deliberative process, it needs to be inclusive, obviously, but it needs to be also in a way set up that you can really discuss different positions and understand where different people are coming from to find a consensus way forward. And maybe another thing to mention is it has to build on existing initiatives. You need to look what's there first to build on rather than starting new from scratch. Next slide, please. So what form could that take, such a partnership agreement? I haven't got the time to go into much detail about that here. And of course, a lot of that is in the report anyway as well. Duncan mentioned the VPA type agreement. That obviously is a way forward with a full traceability system and a monitoring system on top of that as part of it rather. But you could also look at a sort of that a particular country or a particular jurisdiction within a country certifies a certain area as deforestation free, for instance. And that's what the Terpetsaya project, for instance, is working towards. And then the EU could say, okay, we're going to import from that area. And then at the same time, try to increase other areas in that country to do the same thing. There's the IUU, the fishing, the illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing system, which you, Hugo Maria, mentioned, and Duncan mentioned this too. That has a green red card system in it. If a country applies all the laws properly, it gets a green card. If it doesn't apply the laws properly, it gets a red card, and there's a yellow card in the middle. You could think through a system like that as a part of a partnership agreement too. And of course, that could also be at your jurisdictional level as well as at national level. You could combine it with a risk alert system, or you could a combination of all of those systems, and there's more possibilities as it could take as well. So there's a lot to be thinking to be done about that, but there's many options there. What is important, two things. One, of course, it should tie in with the EU human rights due diligence regulation that the DG Justice is working on, as well as with all the member states regulations. And I know the Dutch are just sort of pushing a law forward to build on the child labor law, to make it a much wider law. Other member states like Germany, Switzerland, Belgium, Finland are all doing the same thing. So it has to be tied in with that sort of thinking as well. And last but not least, as Duncan also mentioned, of course, not all countries want to go into a partnership agreements. I mean, it's almost impossible at the moment to see Brazil wanting to go into a partnership agreements, for instance. So it's important that these partnership agreements thinking is being linked with regulation to really incentivize countries to go into that partnership. And if they don't want to do that, to allow the EU to reduce the imports of embedded deforestation to meet its own demands. So an example of this sort of legislation that goes together with that, the partnership, is the EUTR, and also the catch certificate scheme in the IUU. But you can also think of tariffs and quotas and bans. So it has to be a two-sided approach, basically. You need to try the partnership where you can with the countries, but where you can't, you need to have other measures in place to deal with the countries that you can't move that way forward. Next slide, please. Yeah, and last but not least, there has to be consistency. I mean, the problems in the forestry sector, the problems with deforestation, they don't lie in the forestry sector often. They lie in sectors outside the forestry sector. So you need to look much wider and get consistency across the board, both at EU level and at producer country level. We all know in the EU that you have the common agricultural policy, which in many ways sort of almost subsidize the sort of soya deforestation in Brazil. We know we have the Renewable Energy Directive, and we know that when we got that directive, that the palm oil imports into the EU for biofuel, they sort of skyrocketed. We know, Hugo Maria mentioned it already, we've got the Mercosur agreement with the EU is negotiating now with Brazil and Argentina and Paraguay and Uruguay, but the EU is also negotiating with Indonesia a free trade agreement. And these free trade agreements, they really risk deforestation to increase rather than to decrease. So the EU has to be consistent in its approach, that when it goes to approach to tackle deforestation, and as Hugo Maria Schalli showed, there's many initiatives going on, it really needs to look at other initiatives in the EU that might undermine those same policies. And the same goes for the producer country. The amount of agricultural policies that undermine deforestation, stopping deforestation attempts in agriculture in the producer country is enormous. And then last again, but not least, the customary law and the customary rights issue needs to be really tackled together, hand in hand with the deforestation problem. And last slide. And I think I'll leave it at that and hopefully make up some time for you, Jonathan.
Yeah, thank you. That was great, Saskia. And I do want to encourage everybody to look at the report that Saskia has mentioned. It's very rich. Hopefully you can post it in the link in the Q&A or in the chat, so that people will be able to see that. I also want to encourage people to look at the report that Saskia and Duncan wrote together, the Enforcing Due Diligence Legislation Plus, which you'll find in the further reading on the SPAO 25 website. If you haven't looked at that further reading, it has links to all the main documents from the Commission communication to the Parliament resolution that just came out. And so now I'm going to turn over to Felix Holfot, and I assume, Felix, that you will tell us something about the Dutch government's thinking on these issues.
Yes, thank you, Jonathan, and good morning, audience. It's a bit strange not to see the audience and not have a good idea who is in the audience, but I see there are more than 50 participants, meaning all people interested in deforestation problems or problems related to deforestation. So I'm Felix Holfot. I work with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs at the moment in the unit dealing with climate change. And I think that is also good to know that when I started my career within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, also dealing with tropical forest, tropical rainforest, the issue of tropical rainforest was as such at the head of everyone. And now coming back after several years working abroad, I see that forests are first and foremost seen in the context of climate change. But of course, this is going to happen because we, of course, also see the different linkages with let's say, other aspects in development. Next, please. Just as a kind of introduction, talking about forests, we know forests, you find them everywhere. Well, not everywhere, but in different ecological zones. Most of the forests found in tropical zones, and that's also maybe why we all, if we talk about deforestation, we think about deforestation in tropical zones. At the same time, I think it's good to know that there is a considerable amount of forest found, for example, in boreal zones. And deforestation is also rampant there. So actually, if we talk about deforestation, it is also good to always have in mind that there is also deforestation ongoing in other zones apart from the tropical zones. And okay, I'll come back to that later. Next slide, please. So in general, you could say the importance of forest is obvious. It has been recognized in all kinds of different international agreements. You name it, the CBD, the UNFCCC, in the SDGs, they play a part in different international agreements. We all acknowledge nowadays that it is important. We all acknowledge that the problem is complex. But at the same time, we see forests still disappearing. So last year, let's say, while the forests worldwide were burning in August, September, the public, also in the Netherlands, but worldwide, got more ideas about, yeah, we have to do something about it. But it was difficult to exactly to point your finger on, but how can you do it? We have all the commitment, we know why it's important, and still it's not, the problem is not yet solved. Next slide, please. So based on this international acknowledgement of importance, in the Netherlands also we realized that it's not only an international problem and it is far from our best, we also know that wherever it happens, it will and it can and it is affecting us. If you talk in the context of climate change, sea level rise, of course, will affect lower-lying countries like the Netherlands. But we also know that biodiversity, which most of it is found in tropical rainforest, is the essence or the basis of our existence. If you talk about food or medicines or what else. As a small country in the Netherlands, we have, let's say, we depend very much on import of wood. I think about 90% of our wood we consume here in the Netherlands is imported wood. And it is, let's say, forests are also an important part of development cooperation. Next slide, please. Just to focus a little bit on this development cooperation, since, well, I work for the Minister of for Development Cooperation in the Netherlands. So our link, forest, as I said in the beginning, climate change is at this moment, let's say, where we are located. But of course, we acknowledge that the role of forest is much wider in terms of poverty, but also in terms of well, a lot of people, 1.6 billion people, actually, they say they're directly, let's say, depending on forest and forest projects and forest services. But also, if you talk about water management, integrated water management, we know that forest will play a role. And of course, in food production, also forests are an important part for for us and for all the people in the world. Next slide, please. Despite all these things, well, I don't go into all those details, the trends, but just to let's say the increasing pressure and knowledge about forests are still disappearing, and it is a problem. It's a growing problem, the Dutch minister, actually 2 ministers for development, cooperation, and agriculture, decided to send a letter to Parliament to step up in their engagement and commitments to tropical forest. And we have promised recently in March of this year to the Parliament that we will double our financial commitment to tropical forest issues. Next slide, please. So this letter, which you can find somewhere on the website, is let's say sent to Parliament. We have 3 goals, very clear goals. We have to stop deforestation by 2030. There was already an international commitment to halve deforestation by 2020. It is clear that that target has not been met and will not be met. That's also the reason why we have to step up, but still we have the focus on the 2030 timeline, where it should stop, and 2030 is around the corner. Also in line with international agreements, we say we have to increase forest cover, but not only because of the, let's say, the forest cover itself for climate and for products, but also it will reduce the pressure, of course, on primary forests, which are, let's say, the most precious part in terms of biodiversity and the most essential part for a lot of people, 200-300 million people around the world, depending directly on forest products and services. And the third goal, and there's always the discussion, is it a goal or is it a mean? The cooperation. I think it has also been mentioned by the other 3 speakers. The problem is complex. If you want to do something about it, you have to cooperate with others. And of course, as a small country, we really acknowledge that you have to work with others. And if I talk about others, for us as a member state to the EU, of course, the EU is one of the first, let's say, logical allies to work with, and that's of course what we are doing. But also in cooperation with all kinds of stakeholders in this process of making use of the forest. Next slide, please. These 3, let's say, goals or means, we have identified several instruments to do so. 5 instruments I can highlight here, but of course it is clear that the different instruments, well, they're not always that easily distinguishable. But for the ease of the discussion, we have said, okay, we have 5 lines of working. First of all is the policy influence. Even as a small country, we still think we have some influence. We have influence in the EU itself. We actively participating in EU discussions. Let's say that the communication of the Commission of June last year was, of course, also partly because we were engaged in those discussions. Internally here in the Netherlands, we have welcomed the communication and also taken good notice of the Council conclusions in December last year. And we have indicated to the Commission that we are looking forward all kinds of ambitious plans and ideas to take forward this objective. But policy influence also goes through other means. We are contributing to the Global Climate Fund. We are contributing to the Global Environmental Facility. There also you have policy discussions. If you look at the climate fund, a huge amount of money is going there. There is amount of money for reducing emissions related to deforestation and forest degradation. Discussions this year, next year will take place about is this a good instrument? Is it working? Should we ring fence more of our to the GTF, for example, for this specific issue, or should we do other things? So policy influence goes in several directions. and of course also talking with different stakeholders, but actually that's the next point. I think also the three other speakers, they highlighted that the problem is complex. If you want to address it, you have to work with different stakeholders. We are, at the moment, we are working with different stakeholders. We support multi-stakeholders initiatives, often working at the landscape level, where they try to combine value chains with the wider landscape management and giving due attention to forest conservation, for example. Maybe later on in questions I can highlight a little bit more on specific initiatives in which we are engaging. I think another concept which was mentioned by the other speakers as well, governance is at the heart of the matter. At the end of the day, there are different interests in forest and forest products, and you have to balance these different interests, and you have to have a clear and proper way to balance the interests and to take your decisions, and at the end of the day also to being accountable. So our support, which we are giving at the moment, is focusing very much on improving forest governance. That could be in terms of land use planning in certain areas, but also through the flagged and wet facilities, for example. Also, this is a way we see we can support forest governance in different countries. Finance, it was also mentioned by some of the other speakers. With development cooperation money, which is not it is substantial, but it is, at the end of the day, it's not the biggest amount of money. If you want to have an impact, it is clear that you have to look at where private finance is being invested and the impact of that private finance. And we have set up several instruments to stimulate private investment. For example, the Dutch Fund on Climate and Development, but also there is an instrument with the banks, the AG3 funds, and these are all ways to see how with public money we can pave a way for increased private finance. And then last but not least, of course, is our direct support to development countries. If let's say the objective is to reach several of the SDGs, well, which are named in the beginning, which are directly also related to forest, we see possibilities to increase our effort to support developing countries. We're doing so. For example, recently we have signed an agreement with the CAFI, and so with the Central African Forest Initiative, where we support a multi-donor trust fund, or we contribute to the multi-donor trust fund to enable 6 countries in the Congo Basin to address forest and deforestation problems. And then, of course, we acknowledge that you should not only look at forest policies and forest, let's say, accountability measures or governance, but also to agriculture, even to demographic policies, etc. And the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, these are important hooks for us also to support developing countries to join or to link mutual commitments from all kinds of from all the countries party to the UNFCCC, to link the commitments and see where forest and forest-related management and measures could play a role. So that is the last instrument, and it was also my last slide. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. They're also very comprehensive. It's a nice bookend to the presentation by Hugo at the beginning and the 2 presentations by Duncan and Saskia. So now I'd like to give the panelists a very quick moment to react to each other. I'm going to start with Indra van Gisbergen from Fern, who hasn't spoken yet. Indra, could I ask you to take no more than 3 minutes, because there's a lot of questions. Some of them have been answered in written form, but some of them are also wider than the answers. So I'd like to also to be able to take them. So Indra, you want to comment on the discussion so far?
Yes, thank you very much, Jonathan. So I'm Indra, I'm working for the organization Firm. And for more than 5 years, we are campaigning for a robust EU action plan to address deforestation and also protect rights. And the focus on rights is definitely something we wish to see underlined in this debate. And so I would like to react on what has been said by Hugo Shally. The progress that has been made, for example, with the communication of 2019 has been really an important step forward. And I would like to come back also on the initiative that was taken by the Parliament. And so only last week, we saw that the Parliament adopted a very interesting and ambitious report that recommends a very strong piece of legislation. And so we definitely hope that this report of the Parliament, the legislative report, is taken into account when the Commission is preparing its proposal in the second quarter of next year. And in that respect, I think some speakers discussed a little bit about the scope of such a piece of legislation, which according to us is a backbone of the mix of measures that is needed. And we definitely also think that it's important to have a wide scope targeting different companies. It was Duncan as well who mentioned that. It is important to include all companies, including SMEs, but also, for example, the finance sector. It's very important that also banks and financial institutions are targeted by this new legislation. I think that different people said something about the need for a smart mix of measures to address a wicked problem, as Saskia says, and that's really great that also we look at the FLECT action plan as a model to develop this. We only think that there needs to be now really robust also attention to be paid to what's going to happen in the producing countries. And therefore, I would like to come back on what Hugo said, that a platform has been set up, a multi-stakeholder platform, which is in fact a framework for dialogue. But what we do regret a little bit is that so far producing countries representatives have been a little bit absent, and especially CSO representatives have been quite absent from this dialogue that the EC is organizing. So I know time is super short, but we look definitely forward to the proposal that will come out next year. And we also hope that the EC, not only the Dutch, but also the EC will step up also financial means and maybe human resources in different countries to really lead on the discussions to have in the producing countries. And we expect also these discussions to be very inclusive, and it's very, very important that everybody is sitting at a table, including indigenous people, communities, and so on, because we've learned from the VPA processes that with more people on the table, we have better answers also to complex issues such as deforestation. So this in a nutshell, a little bit a reaction. And yeah, if also Hugo could maybe in the questions also react on how the Commission will take into account also the recommendations of the Parliament, that would be fantastic. Thanks.
Thanks very much for that incisive but also concise intervention. And now I do indeed want to give Hugo the floor for a very brief comeback. I mean, I would certainly be interested. I mean, the challenge is that, as you explained, the Commission is still in the process of reviewing and consulting. But anything you can say about the Commission's thinking, or even your own thinking about the specific policy proposals that Duncan and Saskia discussed, or about this issue of stakeholder, of the multi-stakeholder platform, about which there are some questions in the Q&A would be welcome. So maybe 2 minutes.
Thank you. I wanted to come back to some of the questions in the chat, or in the question and answer that I didn't answer already, and I will. I think that I would say that in the further policy mix, we will actually have to look at what works best. And I think that the FLEGT VPAs have a very mixed track record of effectiveness. I think they have been effective in sort of bringing stakeholders to the table, generating discussion, creating civil society participation in producer countries. They have been less successful in actually having an impact on the market. Let's not forget, we have 15 VPAs that have been negotiated over the years. We have, after 15 years, we only have one VPA that actually licenses. So I think we need to see what works best. And I think that is the reflection a little bit that we're making with the forest partnerships, to see, do we actually need that instrument of VPA to have impact on the ground, or are there other ways of doing it? So that will be part of the reflection process. I think that I made it very clear, but I can repeat it. It is a requirement and the policy of the Commission to fully take into account legislative recommendations that are issued by the Parliament. And I think that the instrument that the Parliament is using was initially thought for subject areas where the Commission was not about to legislate. But here we have a lucky coming together of two institutions that want to legislate on something. And we take the Parliament's report as a challenge to see, take their proposal as a basis and see how we can take it further and sort of make something really impactful coming out of our work next year. I think that there are a couple of questions in the chat that were not answered. I think that the Commission obviously is with regard to what came out of the discussion on the CAP in Parliament. The Commission is certainly not very happy with the result of the discussions in the European Parliament and the Council, because we feel that this doesn't go as far as the European Commission proposal did. And I think that is not what we wanted to see. But of course, we have to respect, or will have to respect in the end, what the parties in the co-decision process will come up with. But I think certainly it's not what we wanted to begin with. I think that still the full range of initiatives that are being on the table from the Commission side still make for a very convincing package in that regard. But clearly, the CAP reform as it stands now would not contribute to the European Green Deal as much as it would have with the original EU proposal. I think that there were a number of questions about the proportionality and the how do we assess the impact on third countries. And I think that from my perspective, there's one issue that I would highlight. I think we have an obligation to put our own house in order and to make sure that we don't contribute to the problem. And I think that's one part of the solution. But then we can only participate legitimately in the international discussion if we have put our house in order. And that is sort of why the link between the demand side approach and the supply chain approach is so important. And I think that also, as Felix has said, the role of public development cooperation instruments is somehow limited, because in some of the countries where main issues arise with regard to deforestation, forest degradation, we will not be able to solve that through the instruments of development cooperation, because in some cases those countries are not dependent on and not responsive to development cooperation instruments, but have developed other systems of agricultural production that are important. And I think one issue that hasn't mentioned today, but it's to bring all the major consumer countries to the table and incentivize them to adopt a sustainable and responsible behavior. And I think that's one of the things that we're currently working on. See, can we get countries like China to the table? And which I think, if there was even a political mention made by China, markets would react immediately in a very strong way. And I think that's something that we want to work on with all member states and with stakeholders as much as possible, to see what type of cooperation can we get from important consumer markets such as China and others. Thank you. I'll stop here.
Thanks very much. You went beyond responding to the other speakers, and also started to respond in very interesting ways to the questions posed in the chat. And I think maybe we'll follow that model a little bit. So I'm going to go and I'm going to give the floor to Duncan. And Duncan, one thing that I thought I'd be interested to hear your reactions to, first of all, the questions about the effectiveness of VPAs flagged, but also a question, I mean, that concerns me is the practicalities of implementing broadly based due diligence regulations. I mean, I still have a lot of trouble getting my mind around how the kind of broad initiative that DG Justice is considering could actually work. And relatedly to this, I mean, one possible lesson from the EU timber regulation is that it's hard enough to determine whether products exported are in conformity to domestic laws. The question is, to the extent that the EU would formulate its own criteria, what challenges does that pose for the effectiveness, the implementability of the due diligence requirements? And feel free to take up anything you've seen in the chat, because I'm not sure we will have time for a full round of chat, of Q&A answers.
Sure, thanks very much. That's quite a lot of things to try and answer. So I think I just wanted to react to what Hugo was just saying, and I agree with most of it, actually. And I certainly agree. I guess if there's a common theme throughout what I'm going to say, is that it's that trade incentives and market access really matter. I've worked on trade and environment related issues for most of my career, and you can see countries react to trade measures and market access incentives much more strongly than react to things like diplomatic pressure or availability of development assistance or financing. Those can be important as well. And I agree when Hugo said one of the key things we have to do is put our own house in order. Probably the single most single measure that the EU could take that would have most impact, most positive impact on forests, would be to stop subsidizing biofuels for energy use. And I don't mean just picking out individual ones like palm oil, which is what it's trying to do at the moment, but just stop subsidizing all biofuels, soybean oil, rapeseed oil, etc. Undoubtedly, that subsidy structure is bad for forests, and arguably it's probably bad for the climate as well. So that's a whole other sort of topic that we could get into. I do recognize the problems with the VPA model that Hugo mentioned, and actually David Wardell mentioned in the questions as well. It is a time-consuming and resource-intensive process. and it hasn't led to the structure of licensing systems across the world that it was hoped for. We only see one country, Indonesia, having a licensing system at the moment. I think and also I guess the other problem is that it was expected, or it was hoped, that when countries brought in an export licensing system to prove that their products were legally produced, it would lead to a growth in market share in the EU. And we have seen a small growth in Indonesian timber in market share, but it's not been very significant, and it's been quite limited to some products in some countries. And I think part of the problem there is that the kind of the stick end of the package, the EU timber regulation that is supposed to keep illegal products from other countries without VPAs out of the EU market, has not worked effectively enough. And if you look at the report that Saskia and I wrote, you can see a whole series of reasons why the EUTR, it's not a bad system in principle, but it's not working terribly well in practice, and it could be made to work better. But I think if you want to see change on the ground in producer countries, you have to provide, that means they have to do things differently from what they're doing at the moment, and you have to provide some kind of incentive for them to do that. And I think, as I said before, trade measures and market access are important incentives. So I think if we're looking at any kind of system, we have to say, how can we make these products that are now produced sustainably without deforestation, they have to get some kind of reward on the EU and the consumer market. Public procurement is one small element of that, but there are other things as well. I don't really have all the answers, so I mean that is worth thinking about. I do think the VPA model could work well for cocoa, because the EU is the world's main importer and consumer of cocoa. The two main producer countries, Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, which produce 60% of the world's cocoa, 2/3 of their cocoa exports go to the EU. So the EU is in a much more dominant market position than they were for timber. Also you have interest in pursuing the VPA model in those two countries, particularly in Ghana, for cocoa. I accept that it might be much more difficult for other countries now, and other commodities. Now, Hugo talked about that, and I've heard the Commission, other people from the Commission, talk about the value of the IUU model, IUU fishing regulation model. And I do recognise, I mean, it has a number of elements in the IUU fishing, and I wanted to sort of pose the question to Hugo. One reason why the IUU fishing regulation has been really effective is that when countries get red carded as not controlling their fishing fleets well enough to stop illegal fishing, imports from that country, exports of fish from that country to the EU are completely banned. Just you cut off market access, and that is a major impact. That is a major incentive to clean up their act, and you can see it working with good effect, I think, in some countries. But you can't really see that working for agricultural commodities, because almost all of them, exports are dominated by just a small number of countries, and you can't, it's ridiculous to think that you could cut off cocoa exports from Cote d'Ivoire to the EU. It would be like half the cocoa market. So I can see how the listing system, the yellow card and red card system, might be used as kind of early warning system to encourage countries to tidy up their act. I can't really see how the really quite aggressive measure of cutting off imports completely could work. And then final question that Jonathan asked about due diligence. I agree. I think it's difficult to see how the very broad corporate obligation of due diligence, I think it should encourage companies to take action, but I mean, we can see this in action in France, similar to the Devoir de Vigilance law that came in 2017. And I think it is quite difficult to see how you can enforce that in sort of hard cases. And we have a number of court cases going through at the moment with no real clarity about how that will be enforced. I think, as I mentioned in my presentation, getting evidence of breaches of the criteria from the countries of origin is really difficult. So if it's possible to say, create a condition that companies, part of the legislation, that companies importing products from these countries to the EU would have to make a declaration that those products had not been sourced with deforestation, and you define what you mean by deforestation, clearance of primary forests since a threshold date, 2015, whatever you want to call it. And then you can use external sources of evidence like satellite data to check whether they are really, and perhaps isotopic and DNA testing to check whether they're really sourcing those commodities from the areas they claim, and whether that deforestation has occurred in those areas. That's a practical means of enforcement that doesn't rely on evidence from the country of origin. And I think we have much better data on that kind of thing now. So I think that's an avenue worth exploring at least.
Thanks a lot, Duncan, for taking up all these challenging questions so lucidly. Okay, we're running out of time. What I would like to do is to give the floor back to Felix for a moment. Maybe you can also say from the Dutch perspective what you think about some of the policy options put on the table. Then I want to give the word very briefly to Saskia, and I will finish up by returning the floor to Hugo Shally. And there are some, well, you could respond to some of Duncan's points, but also there are some questions about the relationship between deforestation and EU trade policy, which I think people would like to hear your thinking about. So Felix.
Yes, okay, thank you. I hope you can hear me.
But we can't see you, so turn on your camera.
Yeah, it's on, but apparently it's not working.
Well,
I'm sorry for that. No, just I want to highlight a few points. There is apparently there's an let's say an agreement between all of us that the problem is complex. You have to involve different stakeholders. You have to look at private investments. So that is quite fine. There is an agreement on that. As I think 2 points for me are still outstanding and maybe need some more discussion. The point of the cleaning your own plate, and that is also all our or most of our actions are linked to product chains. And I think, of course, it is good, as Hugo said, that you have to ensure that your own house is in order in order to talk to others. If we talk to Brazil, the first thing Bolsonaro said is, well, what did you do with your forest in Europe? So I think that's an important point, but I think it's a pity if we only stick to the issue of the value chains and ensuring that the products on our markets are sustainably sourced. Because at the end of the day, forests serve a much broader, let's say, interest than only linked to the ones linked to value chains. And a second point, which is very important, and that is still, let's say, also a mission for me in the ministry. If you talk about improved governance, I think it is very essential that you invest in primary and secondary education, because let's say there you will have to build up the capacity to be able to participate in a proper way in governance issues. So we'll never be able to solve the problem only with value chains or only with all kinds of regulations. We have to build up, specifically in developing countries, the knowledge, the capacity to deal with these issues and to discuss the issues in a proper way. So a plea for me, it's a personal plea, but invest more in primary, secondary education, linking this with sustainable development, linking this with problems of forest management and deforestation. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Felix. Inspiring. Saskia, would you like to come in and comment on the discussion so far? Saskia?
Yes, thanks, Jonathan. I'll be really quick. 4 quick points. Own house in order, absolutely essential. More essential than we always think it is. We have less protected areas in the EU than probably countries like Malaysia and Indonesia have. So what right do we have to say these things if we don't do that? Linked with that, Duncan says stop all funding subsidies for biofuel. I would actually go further than that and say stop all funding subsidies for biomass, because our European forests are in a really bad state. The carbon sink in the European forests is going down dramatically. We can't continue to exploit our forests for biomass as well. So that's one point. Second point, VPA. Yes, has it failed? Has it succeeded? I think that is a long discussion, which would be worth having. I agree with Duncan that the stick is a problem. I agree with Hugo that the licensing system has been proven to be very problematic. I do think also with the observatory that Hugo mentioned coming on stream and other measures which Duncan also mentioned when he talked about due diligence, that that might be less of a problem in the future if we don't look at the licensing system that we have done in the VPA process. But again, that's a longer discussion. But I think there are ways out there. I'm surprised by the mentioning of certification and by looking into the role certification can play, because I think we know very well what the possibilities are of certification, and we also know very well what the limitations are of certifications. We know that certification is a good way to mitigate risk, but we also know it's no way to prove even legality, because there's plenty of certified timber on the market which is not even legal. So I think we know all that. So I'm not quite sure why we need to look more into that, but that's another point. And then last but not least, Hugo says we need to talk about China. We need to get other consumer countries around the table. Completely agree, but around the table for what? Because if you look at the Amsterdam Declaration Group, which says that they were going to import only sustainable palm oil by 2020, and if you look what's actually happening in real life in Brazil, we import more risk-related palm oil and risk-related soya than China does. So although we've made all these commitments, that clearly doesn't translate into the reality on the ground. Well, China hasn't made any commitments, and it's apparently buying less risky stuff than the EU is. So around the table, yes, completely agree. But that comes back to the partnership agreement. To do what exactly? And how do we make sure that what we do, what we say that we do, is actually going to have an impact on the real ground? That's really, really the most important thing.
Thanks, Saskia. Great to have these 4 or 5 points formulated so sharply. So Hugo, I'm going to give you the final word to react to what has been said, but also to take up the question posed in the chat about possible contradictions or tensions between EU trade policy and EU anti-deforestation policy. You were very frank about the conflicts with the CAP, and what about, for example, the EU-Mercosur Pact? Does that do enough to fight deforestation in an effective way?
Thank you. And I think that obviously we need to respect time, because otherwise we could go into great length in some of those. So I'm going to try to keep to a number of issues that were raised. I think that on the issue of what is the type of concrete engagement with producer countries in a structured way, I think it's the question of whether we see this engagement in terms of trade, or whether we see this engagement in the terms of cooperation on policy development and action on the ground. And I think with regard to the cooperation on changing attitudes and promote incentives for changes on the ground, probably the forest partnerships that we have in the pipeline are the way to go. And I think that the VPAs, I think, were very good in process, but not that effective in delivering on substance. So I think that's something we need to look at in our impact assessment and in our fitness check even more. I think that we need to develop on the EU side a very clear understanding of what we regard as deforestation and forest degradation free. And I think that that is something that needs to apply to all relevant commodities across the board. And otherwise we will going to be exposed again to challenges that we actually pick and choose and try to single out specific commodities. And that wasn't a very successful thing to do in the context of another discussion related to biofuels. So I think we should avoid that. I think that clearly we're looking at the IUU model as inspiration for a system that would be better, more effective, and easier to operate for operators and consumers than the EUTR, and to see what are the elements we could pick up, not necessarily copy the model as such. I think that's to be very clear on that one. The issue of how to build or what can we gain from trade policy in the context of deforestation and forest degradation. I think we must refrain from overselling the positive contribution of the trade and sustainable development chapters, because they are to a large extent based on the enforcement of global and international commitments in that regard. And that makes it relatively easy to integrate climate change into the TSD in an enforceable way, makes it very difficult to integrate for biodiversity and deforestation into the trade and sustainable development chapters, because there are not corresponding hard international commitments with regard to deforestation and forest degradation. Having said that, I think that the negotiation, implementation, and preparation for implementation provides for a great opportunity to engage with countries that perhaps otherwise are not very keen to engage with us on those issues, and to look at what are the actions that the EU could ask of those countries in view of the full implementation of the agreement. And I think that's a conversation that is ongoing. And I think that's going to be the challenge, to see what is it that we can still extract from our partners in that regard. So I think that's a big challenge from my side, but I don't have the full answer for that yet. But there is a big commitment from the Commission side to make more space for for the environment in general, issues like biodiversity, climate change, deforestation in trade policy. And we've been working with DG Trade a lot at trying to make that concrete. And I think that's really the challenge now, trying to work through WTO, but also through our existing FTAs and for the future FTAs that we're still negotiating. I think I'll stop here, bearing in mind that I think our time is almost over anyway, but I'm happy to respond to any additional questions should there be one. Thank you very much. Back over to you, Jonathan.
Thanks so much, Hugo, for the very candid and thoughtful set of reflections. As you said at the outset, 2021 looks set to be a very exciting year for EU external action against deforestation, and we're all looking forward eagerly to learn where the Commission will come down in terms of concrete proposals after the phase of consultation and review. So I think it just remains for me to thank all of the presenters and also the audience for a very lively and interesting set of exchanges, and to encourage you to participate in the follow-up panel this afternoon, where I and some of my colleagues, Philip Schleifer, Maria Weimer, Laurens Ankersmit, some of whom have been asking questions in the Q&A, will present their reactions based on their own research, and we'll continue the conversation. And thanks to SPAO 25 and ACES for hosting the event and helping with the facilitation.